On the 12th of January, Insidious: The Last Key will be in cinemas, and today I'm working with Sony to recreate a look from one of the characters in the film. And this is one of the characters which has this really creepy, cool hand where they have key extensions on the very end of their fingers. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you a few different ways to recreate this, and then hopefully, regardless of what you have, you can find a way to do it. Now, the first thing I'm going to be using is modelling clay. You could use other things, but I prefer to use modelling clay just because I can use it again and again, and then that way there's less waste. To get the key patterns, I'm going to be using some decoration keys. Now, these aren't the strongest things, so you do need to be a little bit careful when you're pressing them down into the modelling clay. If you have something which is a little bit tougher, then that is perfect. But otherwise, what I have to do is press them down into the clay. I have to use some sculpting tools to press them down so I don't accidentally snap it in half. But then what you can also do is, after you've lifted it off and you've got the imprint, you can go over it with a sculpting tool and just flesh out the pattern a little bit better. Now, because modelling clay can melt very, very easily if it gets too hot, I'm not going to be using a glue gun which is at a very hot setting. Instead, I'm going to be using one which has a much cooler setting, and with these particular glue guns that I have, I can change the nib. Now, you could probably get away with a normal nib, but it's going to be a little bit fiddly, which is why I'm going to be a tiny bit lazy, and I'm going to change the nib so that it's much thinner, and then that way it makes it a lot easier for me to fill in those patterns that I've made. Once I've filled in the patterns, I'm going to wait for it to dry. Now, glue guns normally dry very, very quickly, but just in case, you want to wait at least 5 minutes because I have burnt the absolute life out of my fingers before when I touched glue which hadn't quite cooled down. So if you can, just give it a few extra minutes and then remove it. And because it's in modelling clay, it should be very, very easy to peel out. I'm going to take the same clay that I used for the key casts, and then what I'm going to do is make a model of the finger. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating caps with the glue gun. And what you want to do is you want to take those keys which you've made, you're going to create the cap for the very end of your finger, you're going to press that key down into the glue while it's still hot, put a few extra layers just around the edge, and you might have to hold this into place because if the glue heats up a bit too much, that key is going to slowly start leaning sideways. So hold it until it's dry, then peel it off the model, and you should be able to fit it quite comfortably on your finger. If you're not sure about the size of the finger model, just make the shape, hold your finger over it. If it's too wide or too thin, adjust it, and then you should have it just the right size for your finger. Now, another option is those keys that I showed you earlier. They're so flimsy that they're very easy to snap and they're very light. You obviously don't want anything that's too heavy because otherwise it's going to make it quite hard to be able to stick it to the end of your finger. So I'm going to be doing exactly the same technique that I did previously with the all glue keys. I'm going to be sticking that down onto the cap, waiting for it to dry, and that's another method you can use. Once I've made the extensions for all of my fingers, I want to spray paint these. Now, you can use silver or copper. I couldn't tell from the trailer which colour they were. In some of them they look silver, in some of it looked copper, so you can use either of these two colours, whichever one you prefer. And now we're going to be using Zinc Oxide tape. Now, this is ridiculously easy to get your hands on. You can get this from the first aid section in pretty much any shop. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be cutting a thin strip and then wrapping that over the cap and my finger, and this is going to give me something to hold the cap onto my finger, and it's also going to give me a texture which will make it a little bit easier to stick down things like the Sculp Gel and the scar wax. If it's too flat and if it doesn't have enough of a texture, it can be very hard to get scar wax and Sculp Gel to stick to it, so this makes my life a little bit easier. Now, on my little finger, I'm going to be using Sculpt Gel. I accidentally mixed the wrong amount of the number C for the Sculpt Gel, so it took a very, very long time to dry. But normally, if you mix the right amounts, it's quite quick to dry. So this is an option, but it's also one of the more expensive versions. The cheaper version is this version I just showed you now, which is just to paint over the zinc oxide tape with concealer. But then one of my favourite methods, and also one of the cheaper methods, is just to use latex. Now, you're going to have to lay this about 1 or 2 times, not much more than that because it sticks very, very well to the zinc oxide tape, but just make sure that you can't see any edges between the zinc oxide tape and your finger, and keep layering that. Now, the last method you can use is scar wax. Now, normally I hate scar wax, but it is a very, very useful tool. It's also quite affordable, and with the zinc oxide tape it was a little bit easier to stick down, so I just applied that with a sculpt tool. And then after that I went over it with my fingers, and then over that I went over it with a texturing pad. Normally I prefer the texturing pad because after a certain point, if your fingers get too warm or if the scar wax gets too warm, it's going to start sticking to your fingers, and the texturing pad means that I don't have this issue. Once the 2 latex versions have dried, I'm going to start painting them. Now, you might be able to get away with using a regular concealer if that's all you have, but preferably you want to use something like a grease paint. It's just going to stick a little bit better to the latex. Now to finish everything off, I'm going to be using some ash powder. If you don't have this specific product, what you can use instead is you can use either talcum powder and then try and mix it in with a grey colour, or even use a crushed black eyeshadow, mix it with the talcum powder and then dabble that all over your fingers. And if you can, try and use an old brush which is maybe a little bit destroyed and sticking out in all the directions, so that way you can get an effect which doesn't look too neat. Other than that, you're done.